Hello, everyone, and welcome to the EU Renew webinar series on Europe and the world. I am Carrie Ottoburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Petros Mavroidis, who will discuss his new book, Industrial Policy, National Security, and the Perilous Plight of the WTO, recently published by Oxford University Press. Professor Petros Mavroidis is Edwin B. Parker Professor of Foreign and Comparative Law at Columbia University Law School and a Professor of Law Extraordinaire at University of Neuchâtel.
Stop.
Previous,
No more
oh,
Neuchâtel. It's over.
okay. Formerly, once upon a time. Previously, he served as a member of the WTO Legal Affairs Division and has been a legal advisor to the WTO since 1996. He was chief reporter at the American Law Institute project on the law and economics of the WTO, and his research focuses on the law and economics of International Trade Organization. Also joining us today as expert discussant is Dr. Axel Marx. Axel is Deputy Director of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven. He has acted as consultant to several national governments and international organizations, and he currently is the co-chair of the Academic Advisory Council of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, a member of the Evidencia Research Council, a member of the steering committee of the ILO Labor Provisions in Trade Agreements Hub, and a member of the FECAP Business School Jean Monnet Center of Excellence on Business and Human Rights. His research focuses on sustainable trade, voluntary sustainability standards, human and labor rights, global governance, corporate social responsibility, and EU trade policy. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Petros of approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to Axel to kick off the discussion, and he will offer some reflections and ask a few questions, and then we'll turn to questions from you, the audience. So feel free to send questions for the speakers at any point using the webinar Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. You should be able to see it there just at the bottom of the Zoom window. Please use that to send any questions at any point. I will collect those and share those with the speakers during the audience Q&A section, which will follow the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the EU Renew project. The EU Research and Education Network on Europe and the World, or EU Renew as we call it, is an Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. So on behalf of EU Renew, I would like to thank Petros and Axel for joining us today, and it is my great pleasure to pass the floor to Petros. You have the floor.
Oké. Oké, bedankt voor de uitnodiging, Gerria. Altijd een grote plezier met Leuven te spreken. Hè? I will switch to English because I think most people are not Flemish speaking like the three of us, the four of us, the three of us. So what is this book all about? This is the book. What is this book all about? Well, the book is essentially my tentative response to the question, how does the geopolitical crisis we've been experiencing in the last years affects the WTO? And my response, and that's what I'll try to explain to you today, is that the WTO is imperfectly prepared to address the effects of industrial policy in the name of national security, which is the phenomenon that has been monopolizing international trade in the last years, not just Trump too. Alas, in my view, the enforcement of this inadequate framework has added to the woes, and the very recent events have exacerbated the crisis of multilateralism. In short, I don't see how we can get out from the current mess easily. I'm quite pessimistic about the future. So I'll do four things with you. First, I will describe the current crisis. When I say describe, I'll show you that trade has stalled. What are the measures stalling trade, and what is the offered rationale for those measures? I will then ask the question to what extent this is a new issue. Because if it is an old issue, then we have to ask ourselves, what did the GATT do better than the WTO? And I'll try to show you that the GATT was a totally different context, a different agreement, a different context, and it managed to address this type of issues in a much more effective way than the WTO. In one sentence, what I'll try to show you is that unlike the GATT, what we experience nowadays is a crisis of connectivity. This was not the case in the GATT. We haven't managed to address connectivity in a satisfactory, I wouldn't say optimal, in satisfactory manner. And this is, I see no reason to be hopeful for the near future either. Now, let's start with the first point. This is a graph from the Dutch World Trade Monitor. You observe a couple of dips in the evolution, the growth of trade. The first is the financial crisis, 2008. The second is COVID. Twice, trade managed to recover. Nowadays, it's not that trade is going down, although God knows what will happen next, but definitely trade is not picking up. And the question I ask is, why is trade not, what happens post-COVID that does not allow trade to pick up? There are three factors discussed in literature explaining why trade does not pick up: climate change, industrial policy, and geopolitics. The last two are connected, and this is what I care about in this book: industrial policy on for geopolitical grounds. The measures responsible for this globalization are export restrictions, both on final goods. Think of foreign direct product rule in the US, banning exports of semiconductors, cutting-edge semiconductors to China, or think of China's recent measures, export restrictions on rare earths, both inputs and final goods. Subsidies, practiced mainly by the previous US administration and also by Europe and, of course, China, Japan, Korea, and so on, in order to restore some critical industries which the idea was, or the thinking is, should not fall into the hands of the wrong people. Tariffs have increased, sometimes targeted tariffs, most of the time against China, but also now against the rest of the world. The Biden administration did not undo the Trump 1 tariffs, and the Trump 2 tariffs, we'll discuss later, have increased even more. There is contingent proliferation of contingent protection instruments, a number of countervailing duties investigations, and appearance of new schemes. Think of the European Union foreign subsidies and anti-coercion instruments. These are the measures that are responsible for globalization. Now, I'm not saying that all those measures are in the name of national security, but a very healthy percentage of those measures is in the name of national security. Thanks to an army of people that work with me, I checked the data, and the data you have here, which is the data in my book, is until the end of September 2024. The number of invocations, the number of notifications of measures, like the measures I described before, in the name of national security, it's unprecedented in the history of world trade. And not only this, you can imagine that because everything I explained before is measures which are essentially self-incriminating. If, for example, I say, here is my subsidy, I invite a complaint against me because there is no safe haven for subsidies. You can imagine there is underreporting. Now, if you control through, and I did control in my book, with the data provided in think tanks or international organizations, GTA, Global Trade Alert, Simon Evenet, NPIO is GTA plus IMF, MAGIC is OECD, they report much, much higher numbers of measures in the justified by national security grounds. Now, the problem with this type of measures is the what political scientists call security dilemma. The more you take measures in favor of your national security, the more I'm incentivized to do the same. So we reduce the peace dividend because we have a race now towards globalization. No? Some of those invocations ended up before the WTO. I'll say one thing here, and this is, we can discuss if you wish the legal part. It's not the main focus of my book. I dedicated just one chapter on the legal issues. The outcome, the legal test in one sentence suggests that you can take measures only if you are in a war or war-like situation, making this way the scope for economic security properly understood in times of peace as well, almost a non-issue in the WTO, impossible to defend it. Now, this is a test which does not make many people happy, especially the US was quite unhappy. All this to say that when these measures were adjudicated, they did not normalized trade relations, they exacerbated the pre-existing tensions. Now, this is what we face, and my question now is, how did the GATT handle similar situations? In my view, there are there are more I have in the book, but four main reasons that evidence a different attitude in the context of the GATT. And I have, in my view, always, for whatever my view is worth, the GATT managed to fare much, much better than the WTO. One is the context. The context is different. During the GATT is not just a trade agreement. In my reading, and I shouldn't say mine here because this is the work I did with a good friend of mine, Doug Irwin, when we checked the history of, I think, all of the negotiation of the GATT. The GATT is both a trade and a security agreement. It is not signed only by the winners of the Second World War, the security part, but those winners who were also like-minded players, market economies. That was the trade part. Now, the winners who were not market economies, the Iron Curtain countries, they stayed outside the GATT. Czechoslovakia stayed in, but Czechoslovakia became communist after the advent of the GATT and was a small player anyway. So trade between East and West is no consideration for the GATT. It's done by the COCOM, a different agreement. And essentially, COCOM is a means to, let's say, ensure that the dangerous material will not fall into the wrong hands. Countries practice export restrictions and so on and so forth. So GATT is not the WTO. Heterogeneity, when the GATT is being enters into force, is not a factor. Second difference is the subsidies framework is totally different in the GATT. It's totally different precisely because of what first Polanyi, without thinking of the GATT, but then Ruggie, thinking of the GATT, described as embedded liberalism. In the US, my all-time favorite president in the US, FDR, introduces the New Deal policies. The New Deal policies include generous subsidies for those who were left behind because of the Second World War, among other things. Now, you have to accommodate this type of subsidies in the GATT, so the GATT did accommodate this type of subsidies. It was not the very drastic, draconian, I would say, regulation of subsidies we observe nowadays. Then, national security, justiciability was not excluded, no. There is even one panel which discusses Article 20, a Lane panel, but GATT members in one sentence managed their disputes. They didn't take them for adjudication and resolution through adjudication. They managed to find a way to address, and there are dozens of examples from Israel-Palestine, Israel-Arab countries, to the Falklands crisis and so on and so forth. And finally, Pak and Sagi had a great survey in JEL on industrial policy. When I read their survey, you look during the GATT years, you almost never find industrial policy measures in the name of national security. It's all about the rents. This has changed as well now with the WTO. And now, how has it changed? Well, to me, the main issue, if you wish, is the timing of conclusion of the WTO. The WTO is concluded after the Berlin Wall falls. There is this moment in history where some people, Fukuyama more than anyone else, thought that history had ended and we move into a unipolar world. That proved to be a mayfly. Now, why is this important? Well, you see, if you think that Washington consensus now rules from north to south, from east to west, well, you don't have to think twice about how you write an agreement. You write an agreement for liberal economies. This is not the WTO of today. There are many economies in the WTO, not just China, which hardly qualify as liberal market economies. So we wrote an agreement for Europe and the US, thinking that Europe and the US, this example Well, the difference is how much social policy you have, but the starting point is definitely market economics. And then we ended up with a membership which was not on the same page as the transatlantic partners. We cannot count on due commerce either. We cannot believe that the WTO and liberalization of trade will have a soothing power and soothing influence in international economic relations. The Hirschman had the first critique of due commerce, which I thought was very valid, but the one paper that I like best and influenced my dear friend Andres Sapir and myself as well is this paper by Martin Meyer and Tönning. They make a distinction between bilateral and multilateral dependence, trade dependence. And their point is that when dependence is bilateral, if it is, let's say, a scenario between Switzerland and Austria, then you can say, well, yes, if 80% of my trade is with my neighbor, I will think twice before behaving in a belligerent manner. But when dependence is multilateral, well, then of course you have much more of an incentive to adopt warlike behavior when things go south. We did with Andrea paper, we looked into the FTAs between Europe and the US as hubs with a number of spokes, and this observation was coming back consistently. So we have agreements which don't represent, which are not, let's say, compatible with the existing regimes for the whole WTO membership, and we cannot count on due commerce either. There is no consensus, for example, on the regulation of subsidies. There is no consensus on the justiciability of national security. And then, of course, we have Trump too, and something we can discuss in the Q&A session, things became even worse. In one sentence, what I've said so far is that this is the GATT world. You have trade integration on the one hand, and security concerns it's a circle, which if I have two Venn diagrams here, which are not overlapping, and then we move into the WTO, where security concerns are part of the house, and this is where we are. Now, can we say, okay, fine, this is a problem, but we have a very performant compulsory third-party adjudication regime in the WTO. Let's adjudicate the disputes. In my view, quite frankly, because of their function, first of all, judges are agents. They are not principals. They don't have the mandate to rewrite the agreement. They have to stay within the four corners of an imperfect agreement. If the agreement is imperfect, well, the outcome will be imperfect too. It's as simple as that. Not to mention the mistakes that I mentioned before. But even if they were, let's say, infallible, like our Pope, well, then even in this case, you cannot go very far with an imperfect agreement. We need to regulate, but how can we regulate? The WTO is facing, in my view, a Kindleberger trap. That's a term coined by Joseph Nye. And what is a Kindleberger trap? In Kindleberger's magnus opus, The World in Depression, the hegemon, an absolute hegemon, has the incentive to assume the requisite cost to invest and establish a regime so that smaller players do not defect and will play by rules which are acceptable more or less to everybody. Now, this hegemon still is to some extent, but not the way it was before. I'll show you a very nice graph in a moment. The US does not want to lead the race. Now, there are not too many other candidates. The other candidate is China, but China lacks the soft power to rally the troops. And the third candidate is the European Union, which suffers from other problems. The European Union finds it very difficult to speak with one voice. Even in what we discussed today, well, on national security, on trade, on paper, Europe has one voice, but on national security, Europe has 27 voices. So it's not so easy. So take it to the judge doesn't take you far. Legislate becomes a very, very difficult proposition. What we're left with? Well, we're left with an outdated contract. Unfortunately, adjudicating bodies in the WTO don't like the political question doctrine, so they have a zeal to enforce, and we end up with wrong outcomes, and that's where we are. So, my 5 cents for the future. Everything I told you so far has been exacerbated, of course, by the attitude of the US administration in the last months. for people like me who still believe in multilateralism, for reasons that we can discuss also in the Q&A session, the biggest victim of the US serpentine trade policy is not China or Europe or Canada or Mexico. It's the trading system itself. The reason why we sign trade agreements, it's irrelevant if you're a terms of trade theorist or a rent-seeking theorist or a commitment theorist. At the end of the day, it is to bring in certainty by taming unilateral behavior. These are the two, in my view, the two best papers that make this point. Bill Ethier first, 2006, Carl Handley and Nuno Limao, 2017. Now, if we lose this, then quite frankly, what is the function of the WTO if it is not there to provide certainty? Now, is this something that we can cure, let's say? The best paper I have seen on this issue is a paper by my dear friend Emmanuel Ornelas, an economist from Brazil. Emmanuel makes the following point. Let me show you the graph here. First, this is the US share of the world economy. If you look in the 60s, it was 40%. It was even higher when the GATT was negotiated. And it's been around 24% for the last 15 years. Now, the US with 24% is not a hegemon. You have three big players. There are, if you wish, it's like an oligopolistic market in IO, no? Now, this paper by Ornelas and his co-authors suggests that, well, when we move from a hegemonic to a dominant status, the dominant player has no incentive to invest in the regime like the hegemon does, because the dominant player faces this competitive fringe. So investing in the rules-based system becomes unlikely. I like this argument very much, and that's the main reason why I am pessimistic. So can we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Humpty Dumpty being the WTO. I think we should, even with everything I said, and maybe you might think I need a shrink, in my book I still say there is maybe some hope, because if we lose the WTO, it's not that the gains from trade that go astray. It's not just that. This is the last genuine multilateral forum. We lose the WTO, we lose the only place we have to discuss the regulatory interface. And one question I ask in my book is, how can we tell China, come and help me to address climate change, when we keep China outside the trade game? I mean, these things are all interlinked. You cannot have it your way both ways. It's impossible. So what would I do if I were, these are my genuine 5 cents, if I was given the mandate to run the WTO or decide this issue? Well, first of all, right away, I would remove sensitive cases which are divisive cases from the docket. This is not the time to go through the merits of are you genuinely national security induced, incentivized or no. These things should go to deliberative, let's say, function, which we can definitely improve in the WTO. I have concrete proposals in the book we can discuss later. I would definitely try to legislate where it is feasible. I see feasibility in areas where the number of players is reduced. This could be sector-specific agreements. This is an area where the GATT had a long history, often overlooked. A number of sectoral agreements were signed into the GATT, and the negotiating costs are much, much lower. But there is a huge positive external effect, because the moment you start negotiating even sector-specific agreements, you show that the WTO is still the place to do it. I'm thinking of semiconductors, but this is my workhorse in the book, but there are other examples as well. Finally, it is quite clear to me that we cannot dream of going back party like it's 1994 and say we go back to dispute adjudication as it was. Maybe the most realistic option, I don't say I want that, I said maybe we need that to kickstart the WTO once again. Maybe the most realistic way is to go back to an ICJ type of adjudication. That is, those who want to submit disputes to the WTO ex ante through the optional clause, they can do so on reciprocity grounds. And those who don't, they stay out, but they know they take a risk. Let's say if the EU wants to be one of the good guys, all EU disputes will go to the WTO and be adjudicated, if it's EU and Canada, let's say, by judges. If the US wants to stay out, the US can stay out, but the US should know that whenever they want to go to the WTO, they have to persuade Canada or the EU to go with them. It will be something like the GATT times. Voila! My last slide. One of my favorite authors, Lord Scruton, British philosopher, who was warning us about the teachings of the eternal optimists. Beware, he said, because these guys, they are trouble. And maybe we should think in terms of the worst case scenario, and that should be the guide for our actions from now on. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Petros, for this overview of your book. We'll turn over to Axel now for his reflections and some questions to kick off the discussion. And I'd also like to remind the audience that the Q&A with the audience will begin just after, so you can go ahead and send those questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the window. I see we already have a couple, so keep sending those to me and I'll collect those. Thanks. Over to you, Axel.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Petros, very much for your presentation and also for your excellent book, which I enjoyed very much reading, and thank you very much for the copy we got from you. So, as you have shown in your presentation, industrial policy in the name of national security is surging incredibly, and it's stretching the world trading system to the breaking point. And as you argue, the WTO is confronting an unprecedented crisis, one that threatens to erode its relevance and destabilize global trade. And it's only getting worse in the last couple of months. You highlight how WTO members are invoking trade restrictive measures under the guise of economic security, and the book examines how industrial policy is now frequently justified on national security grounds, complicating the WTO's mission to promote free and fair trade. A significant portion of the book is dedicated to the WTO's legal framework. For you, it's only one chapter, but it's still, for non-lawyers, and a very interesting and also elaborate discussion of that. And also looking at the limitations of what's been happening in recent trade disputes. You argue that the WTO's foundational agreements are outdated and ill-equipped, and it came very well through in the presentation. And you use the concept of the Kindleberger trap to suggest that the countries capable of leading reform are either unwilling or unable, and we'll come back to that in one of the questions. But the end result is leading to stagnation in global trade governance, global trade, and so on. Against this, I think, very sobering background, you remain optimistic. I think it's important to also underline that, in the sense that, and you put it out there at the end, you make a number of concrete proposals and suggestions for reforms, and I'm sure we can get back to some of those in the Q&A and in the discussion. Your proposals, I think, are very pragmatic and aimed at trying to revitalizing the organization to meet contemporary needs. Whether that will suffer or be taken on board is still to be seen, and we can discuss further on whether it's indeed maybe the best option. But maybe also allow me to highlight a few of the many excellent contributions I think the book makes. It's not only a book on a very important topic, but the book displays a great erudition and knowledge of the literature on international trade, WTO, industrial policy, geopolitics, global economic trends, brings together insights and topics on which you've been working for more than 30 years, and having lived through the WTO and followed all the relevant literature, the book is packed with insights, facts, quotes, different sources, weighing arguments, and so on. I think it offers a deep knowledge on WTO, and I think it's very, very impressive work. also what I like very much is the historical account which you bring to the book, and especially how insights on how institutions emerge, evolve, and also become inert, and to a degree stuck in a blueprint on which they were founded. The book reminds us that the many contemporary challenges are partially explained to the history of the World Trade Governance System, and you make the very nice parallels with the GATT, which you also introduced in the introduction and in your presentation. I also think, and maybe also something to further discuss and reflect on, is your emphasis on the end of history context in which the WTO was founded, and how this context actually develops or influences the procedures, agreements, disciplines underlying the WTO. But of course, that end of history context was built on a few assumptions, which, as we know now, do no longer hold true. Now, as you write, it was built on the idea that liberal democracy would be inevitable and that China was on an irrevocable path toward becoming a market economy. And this belief, maybe not only in relation to China, but also other countries, has proven to be misguided indeed. And you make a very strong argument. And in that sense, I think the book also has a much broader or wider theoretical importance in understanding how international organizations evolve and are to a certain degree confined by their initial blueprints on which they were founded. And I think it's not only in the context of the WTO, but also relevant for other organizations. I also, and you did not mention that much in the presentation, except at the end, and maybe some people want to return to that as well, but you make an excellent use of the case study on semiconductors to test and develop your main arguments. The book shows that the semiconductor industry, especially in the context of the discussion on national security, semiconductor industry, which has dual use function both in military, civil technologies, and so on. And you use the semiconductor case study to explore current developments. I also should note that the book is fun to read. Well, I mean, I like a lot your writing style. It's sometimes very direct, very to the point. But that's, of course, also, I think, a major achievement and contribution. And I think the most important thing for the wider audience we have on the webinar here also today, and what we try to do with these webinars, is it's a highly topical book, highly policy relevant, in which you also describe in the presentation, and you offer in chapter 6 a number of very nice or very interesting possible proposals for reform. So I think it's a really outstanding book, and we will recommend it and will further promote it to all policymakers, legal scholars, and so on. But the book also raises a lot of questions, and the questions maybe with which I want to kick off a link more to the policy implications or the policy ramifications of some of the things you discuss. And I might want to maybe pick up on a few things you put in the presentation and in the discussion, and then we can see also in the Q&A feed in other questions. Maybe one, but it's more for me and also maybe for the audience. A question for clarification on whether you can elaborate a bit more on how this whole industrial policy, economic security nexus compares between the major players in global trade, EU, US, China. Are they all invoking these similar types of trade restrictions, or are there differences between the different countries? Second, I also noted it down, and you also mentioned it in your presentation. I think it would be interesting to learn a bit more on your proposal for a committee on national security to discuss these issues. So taking it away from dispute settlement and putting it in some kind of a forum for dialogue. And what would be, at the end of the day, the purpose in the sense of resolving some of the issues which might be discussed? Is it really, let's say, a solution, or is it just some type of proposal to keep the discussion going? Then third, and that relates to some of the things you also introduced in the presentation, it also relates actually to your comparison with the GATT. Much of the proposals you develop in the book are within the context of the WTO, within the framework of the WTO. And I know you try to find solutions within that framework. The question is, if it worked better, I mean, trying to find agreements in a club of like-minded countries, should we not rethink WTO fundamentally and have a WTO plus, or even a different type of agreement organization, which is much smaller in membership, which has maybe different foundational decision-making rules and functions, or not? So you can reform the WTO, but how far do the reform go? And if you would have an alternative system which you would evoke, much smaller in scope between countries who want to find an agreement, a bit like I think you suggest, which might be an option for the agreement on semiconductors, but then in a broader scale, whether that would be another option, or maybe that's also completely unfeasible. And then we also have to discuss who these like-minded countries are in a political and economic context, which is very fastly changing. And then finally, I want to push, because we also, from the European Union perspective, I should say, push you on the Kindleberger trap, what you propose, in the sense that the US is unwilling to lead. China is unable to lead because of legitimacy issues and so on, to lead the reforms. And you also quickly know that, like, the EU as the third player is also maybe not the best place, because they do not necessarily speak with one voice. But isn't the EU the most likely candidate to lead reforms? And if they should do that, would you have any suggestions on how to strategically proceed on that? Thank you very much.
Bedankt. Should I respond, or should we
Yes.
wait for more questions?
No, we'll pass right over to you, and then
Okay.
we will start the audience Q&A.
I'll say briefly, so we'll leave time for, because Axel and me, we meet a lot anyway, and we talk those things. All four are excellent questions. First of all, thank you very much for your comments. I don't think I deserve all of this praise, but coming from you, it's a huge praise. Now, the first point, the similarities and differences between the use of IP, industrial policy, and economic security between the three big players, the instruments are more or less the same. The targets are different. So they all use, the US uses more export restrictions than China, different goods, through subsidies, all three use subsidies. But the targets are different. I mean, Europe was not on board with decoupling from China. ASML, as you know, from our neighboring country, Holland, one machine by ASML is $150 million. The number one market for these machines, EUV, is China. When the US said you cannot sell to China, it was a huge cost. There was a long discussion in the Dutch parliament and between business, what do we do here? Eventually they caved in, but all I'm saying is Well, the instruments are more or less symmetric. The targets are they don't see eye to eye on who do we isolate here. The small yards with a high fence, who should be in and who should be out. Committee on National Security, and he put it much better than I said it in my book. It is essentially to keep the discussion going, but maybe also ultimately the solution. And I'll tell you why maybe ultimately the solution as well. As things stand, if I have a national security dispute and you take me to a panel, let's say you are China and I'm Europe, and I say national security, Article 21, you say, well, how you say this is wrong, blah, blah, blah. I can invoke the first paragraph of Article 21A, which says, I am not obliged to divulge information that I think goes against my interest. Hasn't happened so far. But what if WTO members get wise and start invoking this paragraph consistently? So the record before the panel is suboptimal. What will panels do? Will they draw adverse inferences? I doubt it. Now, if all this to say that even if you go to I don't know what this is. Even if you go down the road of adjudication, you can end up nowhere. At least within a Committee of National Security, we can discuss. There could be some sort of name and shame effects. We might be more willing to discuss if it is behind closed doors, and we might be more willing to understand each other if we do it the right way. And that's where I discuss a little bit cobweb agreements in my book. And I say, well, maybe this is the area where we can, if it is not to enforce it, we can write the first best agreement on national security. They say, what are the alternatives? For example, why didn't you use this and you use that, and so on and so forth. But I take your point that there is an issue here. This is the kind, but Axel, I haven't seen one legal regime that has addressed this issue in satisfactory manner. One. Look at what happened in the European Union when we had national security between European Union member states. Need I remind you of the case between Greece and North Macedonia? This is where we are. It's difficult issues. Where do we go from here? I'll say just one thing about this. I agree with you that, I mean, we have to rethink the whole thing of a WTO. The way I view the WTO, if you wish, is a WTO variable geometry. We should have a multilateral layer where everybody is on board, pure negative integration, but we should rethink Annex 4. We should allow WTO members, to the extent that they want to go faster and further, let them do it. We cannot do it otherwise. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to continue believing that we can all be on the same page forever. We can for some issues, we cannot for others. So we should open up the door of Annex 4. On Europe, in chapter 6, where I discuss, I take the point. I mean, if you see, I'm with you. I say that Europe, with all its problems, is the likeliest. And my proposal was that Europe should work with G20 -2. Take US and China out. Let Europe be part of the G18, let's say, without US and China, and develop proposals, but not by itself. I mean, Europe is already a very good candidate because Europe is not 27 identical players, so it's a microcosm of a WTO, but it is an imperfect microcosm. If you take the two poorest per capita income European nations, Greece and Bulgaria, they are hovering around $30,000 per capita income. And the highest is 90,000. It's 1 to 3. If you look into the WTO, you talk about countries with less than $500 per capita income. So Europe has to do this work with the Brazils and Indias of this world. In my view, the only way this thing might work is if Europe, first of all, manages to speak with one voice on those issues, and then pulls the troops G20 -2, comes up with something, and then tell US and China, this is what the world wants. What do you guys think? That's my proposal in the book. I'm not saying this is what will happen, it will work, but I cannot see anything else. Unless if by magic wand, the US decides to totally reverse course and say, no, we have to redo the system and do it now in a way that.
Okay, thank you very much. Gary?
Yeah, I think we have time now to go into some questions. We have a few, but let's start with three and see
Yeah.
how far we get. Okay, so we have a question from Dirk de Bievre from Antwerp, asking
Dirk de Bievre, the famous political scientist,
that the very one.
is the son of a very worthy father, very, very worthy father.
I don't know about this part, but but I do have his question, which is asking about the view that it is better to have all countries minus one, the US, stick to their bound tariff commitments. How perishable is this cornerstone of the WTO?
How? Sorry?
Perishable
Oh,
is this cornerstone of the WTO? We have another one from Henrique Moraes, who asks that you mentioned a sectoral agreement for semiconductors, and Axel already also mentioned this. Maybe you can go into this a bit more. Do you have in mind something like the information technology agreement or an agreement of a different nature? And then we have another question from Nicola Kohler-Suzuki, who says, you've expressed a rather critical view of du commerce. Could you elaborate on this skepticism? To what extent do trade and investment ties still act as a stabilizing force in international relations? And if these economic interdependencies weaken, are we not at risk of accelerating geopolitical tensions further? Let's start with those three and see if we have time for any of the other ones.
okay, let me start with the geachte Professor de Bievre, whose father I have a huge intellectual debt to for the rest of my life. How perishable is the WTO cornerstone? Honestly, let me put it this way. This is a very imperfect response, and although it's been in my mind for you cannot believe how much time now, and although, as I was telling you before we started the discussion, I keep writing one paper after the other for Bruegel on exactly this issue. The events surprised me so many times in the last 3 months. It's just mind-boggling. I mean, just think about if we, the three of us, we had met in December. We were all in New York, and I told you, well, the US will claim Greenland and will impose tariffs between 25 and 100% to everybody before Easter. You would have thought I'm Pinocchio and my nose will grow, no? Something like this effect now. And if I had told you on top of it, and 2 days later, tough is that you will press on the pause button, you say this guy needs a shrink for sure. But this is where we are. I am very, very worried. I'm very worried. I want to see, to give a little bit more elaborate response to my dear friend Dirk, I want to see what will be the reaction of Europe first and foremost, once we have trade deflection from China, because it is quite clear now that the US will keep the high prices on China, the high duties on China, sorry. Where will all this produce go? There are not many markets it can go. The obvious market is the European Union. What will it entail for Europe? Will Europe say, I open up my markets and accept solar panels and electric vehicles that I have imposed 5,000 times duties against? I don't know. So this we haven't seen the worst yet. I mean, pressing the pause button to me is not panacea. I honestly am very skeptical about the future of the WTO. That's all I can say for now. I'm not optimistic. On sectorals, I mean, the idea for sectorals would be to have the supply side of the market, let's say, discuss what do we do with the semiconductors, because semiconductors it is an input to your home appliances. You need a semiconductor for your fridge or for your computer, but it's also cybersecurity. So we have to come up somewhere with an agreement and say, okay, if it is, for example, I'm not saying this is what will happen, and you cannot believe how much time I spent with the semiconductor industry, especially in the US, not because for any other reason, because these are the guys who know inside out what's going on. And in the SIA, you have members from all over the world. The American and the Association is not just the Americans. They have also non-voting members, Europe, China, everybody's there. Now, we have to come up with an agreement which says, okay, fine. I mean, there are maybe cutting-edge semiconductors, if it is speed X and above, which we don't sell, we keep to ourselves. But legacy semiconductors we can trade with each other, it doesn't make any sense. And then this type of agreement I have in mind among the suppliers, not among the buyers. Anyway, will benefit. They can impose 0% duties. If there is a cartel, you take them to the court, the competition authority, you can do those things. Do commerce. So do commerce, I did not do anything on do commerce other than read again Hirschman, but most importantly this paper. Now Hirschman put his arguments at the theoretical level, and these three guys, they checked the last 150 years. And by the way, their paper is 2008, which is, there is another case came later, which made their point even stronger. Now, what do they say? They say that, let's assume, Kerry, you are Canada and I'm the US. So let's say we have 80% of my trade goes to you and 80% of yours goes to mine. Well, in a case like this, bilateral dependence very high, and you can measure those things. We observe, they looked into the real world. We observe that for the last 150 years, there's been no belligerent, bellicose, pugilistic behavior. But where do we observe this type of behavior? When dependence is at a much lower threshold. What does the WTO do? The WTO eventually, in the long run, wants to end up with optimal allocation of resources. Optimal allocation of resources, by definition, means multilateral liberalization, that is, multilateral dependence as well, which means that do commerce, you should not see too much in do commerce. That's the point that they make, empirically proven for the 150 years. By the way, as of 2014, 6 years after their paper, and 2021, recently, 22, sorry, even in countries with important bilateral dependence, we did observe in our neighborhood belligerent behavior, Russia, Ukraine. So I think the better arguments are against assigning too much of importance on do commerce. There is, I'm not saying there is nothing there, there is something there, but this is not what is guiding policies, empirically speaking.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the time that we have for today, unfortunately. I will pass along some other questions over to you in case you're curious to see the other questions from the audience.
Definitely.
But and thanks to everyone for sending in your questions. It's been a pleasure to have this Q&A going. But before leaving you, I would like to announce that our next webinar will bring in Jennifer Clapp on her book, Titans of Agriculture, How a Few Giant Corporations Came to Dominate the Farm Sector and Why It Matters. And then in June, we'll have one with Wolfgang Weiss and Cornelia Frugalita on their new book, Open Strategic Autonomy in EU Trade Policy. It's another one on trade that'll be coming up in June. You can see those at eu-renew.eu and sign up for those there. I would like to once again thank our guests, Professor Petros Mavroidis and Dr. Axel Marx, as well as all of you in the audience today for taking part in this webinar and sending in those questions. And hope to see you again soon. And thanks so much. Take care.
Louis.